Good afternoon. Is that good, or is there still an echo? I'm going to touch on a little bit of what each of you spoke of previously, but I'll start with Dr. Murray's underclass, because New Orleans is the story of what happens when that underclass becomes part of the dominant culture in a city. And viewed in that light, I see Katrina not as the story of individual and family poverty as evidenced by economic and financial statistics, but I see it as the story of civic poverty and how civic poverty can eventually consume and destroy an entire American city if it goes unchecked. Now, as John said, the first things most outsiders from New Orleans saw after Katrina was what they perceived to be the images of deep-seated poverty in this American city, and specifically deep-seated black poverty. And the president is among those who saw this. In Jackson Square on September 15th, 2.5 weeks after Katrina, the president said that this was what Americans had seen was the result of deep, persistent poverty with its roots in racial discrimination. And the president said that he would use federal resources to confront this poverty with bold action. Now, much of what he thought he saw was echoed in the national media. In the national media, we've read hundreds of stories about how more than a quarter of New Orleans families were below the poverty rate, and how the vast majority of those families were children. But New Orleans the vast majority of those families were black families with children. The story of New Orleans would not be particularly compelling if it was just that, a story that was more poor than most cities and a city that had more black citizens than most cities. But what it really shows is the danger to all American cities and to first-ring suburbs under strain as well, that the danger of letting an underclass mentality, the mentality that Dr. Murray spoke of, that is this mentality that legitimizes illegitimacy and crime, become the dominant governing mentality in a city. Now, to understand how New Orleans got to be this way, I will just review a couple of the statistics we've heard already. By Katrina in New Orleans, more than half of the families with children in the home had no father in the home, and in practice that means the vast majority of children, because families without the father in the home tend to have more children. And of course, this is no surprise, because as we've heard tonight, nearly 70% of black children are born out of wedlock, and New Orleans was a city that was nearly 70% black before Katrina. So in one sense, New Orleans was the case study of the trend of the family, and in particular the black family, over the past 40 years, since the beginning of the Great Society, really. And to know how unusual this was before the Great Society, in 1960, in the nation, only 1 out of 4 black children was born out of wedlock. And of course we know today it's 70%, but even more specifically to know how unusual this was in New Orleans before the Great Society. In the late 1950s, when civil rights groups were starting to find pilot families to go through their court cases and desegregate the public schools, the civil rights groups actually dropped one 5-year-old girl at the last minute because they found that her parents had not been married when she was born. Now, they were married by the time she was 5, but just the fact that they hadn't been married when she was born lent the family an air of illegitimacy with which the black civil rights groups did not want to be associated with at the time. So that gives you an idea of the deterioration of the family just within one city. And of course, as we know, this is not just a black problem. The white rates of illegitimacy used to be negligible in 1960. Now they're about they're actually above what the black rates were back then. So this is a national problem across races. Now, there's a clear link between the breakdown of the family and crime, as the nonpartisan Institute for Marriage and Public Policy has published 20 out of 23 peer-reviewed studies over the years 2000 to 2005 found a link between married parents reducing the individual risk that a child would grow up to commit crime, as well as the risk for the community. So in a city where, in many neighborhoods in New Orleans, it's not only there are many families without fathers in the home, it's just that the institutional memory of the two-parent family, even as an ideal, has disappeared. It's gone from people's minds, and the effect of this is really startling in New Orleans. We have a city that before Katrina had one of the highest homicide rates in the nation for a good quarter of a century, 7 to 8 times the national homicide rate for large cities. And this would mean in New York City with 6,000 murders in New Orleans. The situation was similar to that, when New York felt that it was in crisis when it had 2,000 murders. And now many people, including people in New Orleans, would say, well, this is a problem of the inner city. This is drug dealer on drug dealer. This is crime that's in housing projects. This is not our problem. But anyone who has lived in New York, lived and worked in New Orleans for long enough knows that this vicious culture of murder has really seeped into every aspect of the city there. And I worked in New Orleans at a bank. I worked with many black mothers, and the only thing they wanted for their kids is for the kids to go away to a different city to college and just get out. People were worried that their kids walking home from school, walking home from work would be robbed, shot, and this is something that it has led to the decline in New Orleans' population since the mid-1960s. Just since 1990, New Orleans has lost, before Katrina, had lost nearly 10% of its population, and most of those who left were educated and young, and this is akin to a third world brain drain when people will leave, the smartest people will leave first, leaving behind those who don't have the fiscal or the human resources to make what makes a successful city anymore. And now, one obvious question to ask is, why didn't New Orleans just stop this crime? We know from New York's experience over the past 15 years that the answer to violent crime in the short term is very simple: get the violent criminals off the streets. And New Orleans never did that before Katrina. This was a city where the criminal justice system, from police to prosecutors to sentencing judges, was broken. And just some simple statistics will show you, in New Orleans, only 12% of people arrested for homicide are eventually convicted and sentenced for that crime, compared to about 50% for an average city like Houston. And on robbery, only 18% of suspects who are arrested are convicted and sentenced to prison for that crime, compared to about 60% for an average city, not even a stellar city, but just an average American city. Now, this meant that criminals were right back on the streets, that there was no confidence in the city's criminal justice system. Victims would not report crimes, witnesses wouldn't testify, and it really was a city without a working criminal justice system. If you wanted to see an American city without a working criminal justice system, New Orleans was it. And unfortunately, because of who was the loss of the middle-class population, both black and white, from the 1960s on, it really changed who was there to really be outraged about this crime, because so many people had already voted with their feet. Many of the people left behind, certainly not a majority, but enough of them to make a big difference, would never vote for a candidate for mayor who ran on, say, a tough-on-crime platform, because too many voters had a sympathy with defendants simply because they've had relatives who have gone through the criminal justice system, sons, nephews, grandsons arrested. people don't trust the police, in part because the police department has been so corrupt over the past 15 years. And people also perceive a candidate, even a black candidate, who would run on a tough-on-crime platform to be a racist. That's why earlier this spring, when Mayor Nagin was in a debate for the re-election campaign, when someone asked him whether he wanted violent criminals